are you from? You there? Yeah.
I'm from Lithuania.
Lithuania. Awesome. And yourself? Netherlands. And you there? Yeah. Italy. Okay. So who here has ever been on some kind of exchange? Maybe for work or for university? Yeah? Okay. I want you all to close your eyes and to imagine yourselves back there. I want you to imagine yourself at some kind of cocktail mixer event. And the goal of the event is to meet as many foreigners as possible, maybe meet a few eager locals, and you're kind of standing there in a group of people, yeah? You can visualize it with me. And you're listening to this rerun of a story that your friend has been telling all week long. He's been telling every single new person he's met all week the same story, and you're just listening to it. And suddenly, this very confident person walks right up to you. Hi, I'm Sophia. Or, what up, I'm George. Silences the whole conversation. Now, there's only a handful of questions that can come after that, definitely in that situation. And the one to me that is most annoying is, hey, where are y'all from? The most annoying question for anyone that has just spent a whole week every single evening at one of these cocktail mixer events. For me, it just gets a little bit worse. So maybe just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm coming from, I'll introduce myself elaborately. So, my name is Alain, and I'm technically Dutch-Canadian. Now, someone will say something with relation to Canada, and I would have no idea what they're talking about. So I'd go on. Well, I got the Canadian citizenship from my mom, but I never really had a chance to live there. So you're Dutch. Well, yes and no. I lived there the first 3 years of my life, but ever since I've been moving every 3 to 5 years. Ooh, where'd you live? Well, I moved around quite a lot. So I started off in the Netherlands, then we moved to Ireland, down to the south of France, up to Belgium, up to Scotland, a few places in between, and now finally I'm here in Italy. So your parents are like diplomats? Well, my parents are cool, but not that cool. My dad's an engineer, and my mom took on the mighty job of raising 4 of us. And we're a handful, trust me. Now, so we just moved around for all sorts of reasons, sometimes for school, sometimes for work, and literally sometimes just for the sake of adventure. My parents would say, hey, let's just go move. And so we'd move. And this really comes from my mother's side, really. My mother, who is obviously the daughter of my grandfather, my grandfather is Indian, and he's from New Delhi, and he was a professor in international law. So they moved around from campus to campus all across Africa, North America, Europe, and in India, naturally. And so moving around was just a natural part of our family, and my dad, who's Irish, picked it up as well. Now, as you'll all agree, it's a lovely story to start off any conversation with. And I'm sure there are people with much more exotic stories than I have. However, I'm quite sure that everyone will agree that after a while, it becomes quite monotone and formulaic. I know how the conversation's going to go, and I know every single step afterwards. See, most people are able to kind of mitigate this situation. I could start off by saying, hi, I'm Alan, and I'm Dutch. But that's not really true for me, especially when there's Dutch people around me. They'll immediately pick up that I've got this weird Flemish accent, or I make these little grammar mistakes, even though it's my mother tongue. So for me, the question where I am from usually starts off with, oh gosh, here we go again. And then an as short as possible description of my life, to remain truthful without completely steering the conversation into my own direction. So, the question of where I am from, what does it essentially really mean? If we really look at the question for a moment now, if more and more people are having these complex identities lately, surely the question is then not really relevant, or should we be looking at something else? Now, if we take a step back, let's just look at the question. The question of where I'm from is a tool, right? It's a tool to identify individuals in the least amount of steps, just to try and identify and see who we're interacting with. For example, if a person has only met one Italian all his life, obviously, the next time he or she meets an Italian will be based on these preconceived ideas of the former Italian that they've met. This is kind of called categorization. And everyone does this. We do this with Americans in Hollywood movies and Indians in Bollywood movies. Everyone just does this. And so the question of where you're from is essentially then to determine, to identify the individual and then establish some kind of social context we're working in. This is called cross-cultural intelligence. See, on the one hand, we've got our social awareness, and then on our other hand, it's our ability to adapt to the new cross-cultural context. So someone with elevated CCI, cross-cultural intelligence, is able to, for example, determine the appropriate conversation topics, the right gestures, just dependent on who he's interacting with or where they are. Now, obviously, as this CCI index has been developed by psychologists, and these people are very cruel people that try to make us stress as to whether we reach at least a little over average. And since that you're way too many people here to identify individually, I'll just give you two benchmarks so that you can kind of situate yourself. I hope you fall somewhere in between. Now, what determines our level of cross-cultural intelligence? Well, several studies have shown that it's the amount of exposure we've had to other cultures. So the more you're exposed to another culture, the more you develop this sensitivity to the differences. And this also happens on much more macro levels. So if you have whole communities that are moving with each other and integrating with each other, they get influenced. This is called polyculturalism. That's because communities themselves don't exist in vacuums. They're always influencing each other. Like, take for the UK, where tikka masala has essentially become an inherent part of British cuisine, right? Now, if your community determines it as well, then surely people in big multicultural cities, such as New York, where there's a melting pot of different cultures, these people naturally have a slightly higher CCI than, for example, someone that comes from a village with very little cross-cultural interaction. Don't worry, you're not all predetermined people. Obviously, you can change this on your own by traveling and positively engaging with other cultures to determine your own cross-cultural intelligence. Now, let's take this back to the original question of where you're from. Naturally, if you're at a cocktail party, it's the most easy question ever to ask. Just ask the question, and the rest of the conversation just kind of, flows by itself. Well, as conversation goes, real long-term connections are made through having, the more similarities you have, the more possibility there is to have a long-term connection. So, for example, think of it in checkboxes. You've got your age, check, interests, check, hobbies, check, and then you start asking the question, where are you from? And then it's, we're different. Because at the moment you ask the question of where you're from, you establish this wall of difference. I am no longer part of you, and you are no longer part of me. And therefore, we are different. And often, as with my introduction, people are interested, are curious, and we continue on this topic of differences without really getting to the point of where we really get to interact, especially at these fleeting cocktail parties. Now, obviously, if the question of where you're from does not increase the odds of long-term connections, is it then desirable? Well, that's questionable. But the question of where you're from has always been there. Give me any time when the question of where you're from would not have been relevant. So, let's take a socio-historical perspective of it. A socio-historical perspective would say, hey, the question of where you're from is to identify individuals. And that is because individuals themselves strongly identified with their home community, especially 40 years ago, just for example. If you take 40 years ago, we're in 1978, in the middle of the Cold War. Where you were from was important. It really identified your group identity. And therefore, the question of where you're from was both accurate and relevant to any conversation. The way that group identities work, though, is it's based on two simultaneous processes. On the one hand, you've got this fictional narrative that really makes this group identity, so some kind of purpose or raison d'être, and you all, lead under that banner. And on the other hand, this other process is this distinguishment of the other. So your social cohesion really increases the moment you are different from another group. Take, for example, football. This is the best example ever. You're at a big stadium at the Football World Cup. You are all believing that your team will win, yeah? And the moment you see the other team's fans, oh man, you really feel part of a gang. Now, football is quite a trivial example, but group identities really work also with relation to, for example, religion, to ethnicities, to nationalities. At times, these become even more important. Although, over a longer term, we've been seeing that they've become less and less important and less a part of the daily conversation. Now, every individual themselves can be part of different group identities. That's because every individual consists of different identity layers. On the one hand, you've got permanent identity layers, which were originally taught as your religion, your ethnicity, your gender, and just general main backbone identity elements that would stay the same wherever you are in life. On the other hand, you've got your more non-permanent identity layers. And these identity layers are much more based on social, time, and place factors. For example, yourself, you weren't the same person as you are now as when you are 18 years old. I hope. Now, if we've got different identity layers, and you're actually thinking about this, I'm sure most of you are feeling that there's some kind of discordance here. It doesn't really make sense. That's because if you consider it, the more that society has been evolving now, the more that some of these permanent layers have been shifting to the non-permanent side. Just think of gender. Gender was originally taught as such a permanent element and is now very much non-permanent. For me, it's my national identity. My national identity is no longer part of my permanent identity, but something that's always been changing. The more and more I move around, the more I feel like the last place I lived. So, for example, when I'm living now here in Italy, I feel a little British. And, and when I move to Germany, who knows, I might feel a little Italian, The more you move around, the more your identity starts fading a little bit. And the moment you have actually lived abroad in different communities longer than you've actually lived in your home community, you kind of fall between the cracks. You're no longer really part of the new community, well, your old community, I'm sorry, because your accent is a little different, you've got maybe slightly different customs. But you never really belong to the new community, but hey, you're still a foreigner. Even though your national identity might have changed slightly towards that. So therefore, is the question of where you're from relevant? More and more individuals are falling between these cracks. And the question of where you're from really just makes a wall and limits that to a certain extent. That's because of the question of where I was from, or where you are from, essentially was designed for individuals that came from one specific location, and of which we could also further extrapolate, for example, their religious background or their ethnicity. That's no longer the case. 40 years ago, yes, the question of where you're from was relevant. Today, it's debatable. What about tomorrow? What about in 40 years' time? When I'm 65, will I still be asked where I'm from? Now, if the question of where you're from consists of two levels, doesn't help on the personal level and really makes a barrier. And on the other hand, isn't accurate anymore, well, surely then, why should we keep asking the question of where you're from? Now, I want you all to close your eyes again, and I want you all to imagine yourself back at that cocktail bar. You're standing, between your friends again, surrounded by the rest, and you're listening to this rerun of a story that your friend keeps telling every single time. And Sophia or George walks right up to you. They walk up to you, and they strike a conversation. And they don't ask you where you're from. You're having this lovely conversation, and it goes so well that you decide that to actually have another coffee with them the following week. How different would it feel if only now they asked you, oh, by the way, where are you from?